Welcome back to another reading and correcting with me, Kindar, the Tiger Writes, and Ty, the Tiger Supervisor. These are where I read a chapter from one of my stories and correct it as I go. If you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. And if you are looking to support me, that is on my Patreon. Today we are going through chapter 11 of The Captain's Heart. Jeremy looked around, trying to understand why the corridor was deserted. Hadn't there been a crowd not long ago? He didn't recognize where he was. Why was he in a section of the station he'd never been in before? A stool bag was in his hand, and that man, work. He was going to work. But he'd be familiar with the corridor if he was going to his office or one of the labs, which meant... And where was that sign coming from? A hissing, nearly indistinct. Was there something wrong with the ventilation system? He hoped not. Maybe fur had got into it. Wouldn't that be a riot if the cats had clogged the vent? He stopped, dread forming. The cats. Something about them, about his tool bag, about why... Okay, this is going to be... About why he didn't know where he was. About not wanting to go where he was heading. A sound. Something behind him. Something warning him of danger. Then he saw something ahead, through the multitude of banners hanging on post. A form, partially hidden by the fabric, waving about in the wind. A large form, teeth glinting in the sunlight, looking at him, wanting him. Jeremy stepped back towards the sound, and it shifted, encouraged him, promised him safety, ease, soothing of all his problems. Another step, and the form before him roared, a defiant sound, fierce, threatening. Jeremy turned and ran into something. The cry strangled itself as he sat, trying to push himself out of. Jeremy looked around in the darkness. What had that been? Scary, you remember that. There had been something ahead of him that... Something had been around him, wrapped tightly, almost choking him. The sound... He shook his head and let himself fall on his pillow. Whatever the nightmare had been about, it was over now. He glanced at the clock, then closed his eyes. He needed to get all the sleep he could for the day that waited for him. Jeremy had never been in this part of the station, and it felt like hardly anyone else did. He hadn't encountered anyone since entering it. He'd taken it easy on waking, the unease from the nightmare still there, even if he couldn't recall anything of it. He'd had a hearty breakfast because he'd expected he'd need the energy to deal with the work and the people he'd have to work with. He'd showered, dressed, made sure he had his pills, deterred by his office for his tool, and Dad had requested directions to the Kelsirian's ship docked to the station. And now he was in this section he hadn't known was there, heading for the lift. His earpiece told him was at the end of the corridor, and he couldn't shake the feeling he shouldn't be proceeding. He passed intersections with no one in them. Maybe this was set aside for an expansion, although the air didn't have that artificialness that came from a system recently turned on. They wouldn't power a section no one used, would they? He looked over his shoulder and, of course, the corridor was empty. He shook himself and continued towards the lift that was now visible at the end of the corridor. He needed to focus. He had a reactor to repair and do so as quickly as possible. The lift opened onto an empty drab gray dockside, larger than any Jeremy had been on. Not that he'd been on many of them. The only time he set foot on a dock was to board a ship going to Earth or coming back here. He'd only taken three trips in the 5 years he'd worked here. He'd expected people, at least. The quiet was eerie. Where had Williams said the ship was docked? Had he said? At least he knew where to go. The opening in the firewall had someone black standing in it, probably the cat you would be working with. He waved, then wondered if that was something the cats even recognized. The one in the opening didn't respond, so maybe not. He looked at the length to his left and right as he approached the ship's entrance. No one. Not even an automated equipment moving stuff. Not even automated equipment moving stuff. Maybe, like the section he'd walked through, this was for an expansion? But why have them docked here? Hi, he called. Okay. For some on the left of his chest, which was white. The gray vest. Black sleeve. That was fine. The gray vest. Okay, I'm going to go back. I don't need. All right. The vest lacked sleeve and was gray like the pants. He looked to be it. It. It looked to be made of a polymer instead of natural material. He didn't wear shoes or boots. The muzzle was larger than the ambassador, but much smaller than Growler's, and his ears were triangular. He looked more dangerous than the small cat, but nothing like Growler did. I'm Jeremy. He offered his hand. I'm here to fix your reactor. The cat looked at it, then him, the ears tilting. He said something, but the rumble didn't hit Jeremy as hard as the previous day. Some of that had to have been because of his stress. He lowered his hand. I'm afraid I don't know your language or that federalized one. Aren't you waiting for me? The cat's answer was meaningless. Jeremy motioned around him. How about I just go in then? I'm sure I can find someone to tell me where the reactor is. The cat looked over his shoulder, so Jeremy moved to step around him, only for him to block his way. What he said was again meaningless, but Jeremy got the warning. Maybe you need to call someone. They'll tell you I'm supposed to be here. He tapped his ear for emphasis, but the cat didn't react or say anything. Jeremy considered calling the commander to tell him someone was being difficult, but he suspected that unless he'd exhausted all options, the commander wouldn't be impressed with him. Maybe he could get someone in communication to call the ship so they'd tell this one to let him in. Would they even acknowledge the request? The meeting had been between the commander, the captain, and the ambassador. It probably had to be one of them who gave the instructions. Did that mean he was out of option and could call the commander? Not quite. Jeremy darted to the left of the cat and impacted an arm that felt like metal. The cat shook his head as Jeremy backed up, rubbing his chest. So much for cats being all fur and bones. There were definitely muscles under that fur. Did a shake of the head mean the same thing for them as it did for humans? That was unlikely. He feigned right, then darted left, and bounced off an arm again. An arm again. Another shake of the head. This time the cat said something, the growling more pronounced. He spoke again after a silence, and Jeremy figured he was finally telling someone he was there. Except that instead of stepping aside, the cat fixed his gaze on Jeremy with a twitch of the lips that made him think he wanted to bare his teeth. Jeremy turned and started for the lift. He was done with this. He'd tell the commander in person, and he could deal with the cats and their reactor if... Wait! Jeremy looked left and right, wondering who'd said that. Wait! Here! He realized it came from behind and turned. The cat in the entry was also turned, had also turned, looking at a smaller brindled fur one waving and running toward them. I hear. The black cat said something, and the brindled one responded. Then, when he was level with the other cat, he stopped and put his hands on his knees, panting. The pants were brown, and the vest was orange, with the visible pockets on the inside and the... Jeremy fought the chuckle as he realized the vest was inside out. The black cat glanced at him, and Jeremy stopped approaching. The two cats spoke, then the brindled one hurried to right his vest and looked at his pants inside. He straightened. His muzzle was more like that of the black cat. The ears were also triangular, but the tip looked like he'd forgotten to trim them. His eyes were gray and looked at Jeremy. Not know now, he said, then shook his head. Now is... He moved his hand as if he was grasping at something, maybe words. His English seemed to be basic. He placed a hand on his chest. Turok. At least that was clear. Jeremy mimicked the gesture. Jeremy. Turok said something, then Jeremy. I have no idea what that was. Turok repeated the word, and the black cat said it too, although there was a sense of a question in it. Turok spoke quickly, and when he was done, the black cat was looking at Jeremy with narrowed eyes. Not know, Turok said. Tell him. Come. The cat moved onto the ship and motioned for Jeremy to follow him, if the gesture meant the same thing. The black cat kept his eyes on Jeremy as he stepped on board, keeping as much distance between them, and then hurried to catch up to Turok. Only then noticing how wide the corridor was. A dozen people could easily stand side by side in it, and it had to be 5 meters in height. The walls were green, varying shade of it, with the ceiling in white and blue. There would be a comma here. While the floor was in browns, red, and greens, almost brindled like Turok's fur, while the colors on the wall looked streaked, and his feet sunk slightly into the floor. He glanced at his companion's feet, and there was no indication of claws. It was only after that he noticed the light was low, more like getting near dusk than the full light of the station. Maybe they would rise it later. Maybe they worked on the day-night cycle. Each corridor they passed or walked through was just as wide and high. Colors varied, but were all mixed and vibrant. Certainly not what he was used to from the station or the few ships he traveled on. They had been passenger ship, not trade ones, so maybe they had to account for cargo being moved. Only, it wouldn't make sense to have to move that all over the ship or even over the part he'd walk through. Cargo hangar would be together for ease of access when docked. The few people they encountered stared at him. At them. At him, Jeremy expected. They were dressed similarly to Turok, pants and vest, but varied in style. Colors varied in style. Come on, there you are. Colors and accoutrement. Some had sleeves, others didn't. Some had tools attached to them, others not. You know what? We're sticking with that. Some had armbands or bracelet or earrings. They also came in all sizes. Jeremy's stomach gave a flip when a tall and muscular cat with hair falling over his chest rounded a corner, and for a second he thought he was looking at Growler. Then the hair registered as not matching, and the eyes that stared at him were green instead of gold, and it settled. Turek had tried to tell him something as they walked, but had given up, his limited vocabulary not being up to it. Jeremy pulled his arm away from Turek's attempt to grab him and fought an irrational desire to snap. He really didn't want to be touched by one of them. His anger was overwhelmed by what he saw beyond Turek and the understanding of why he'd wanted him to stop. The room was vast, felt like a poor descriptor. He stepped in and it stretched at least as far on each side as it was deep, with openings onto other corridors. Control stations were spread along the walls and around the central piece of equipment. That it had to be the reactor, but he'd never seen a design like this. Easily 4 times his height, at least in width, and with readouts along it, possibly other controls among them. There was one strange thing about the room. Where is everyone? And that concludes chapter 11 of The Captain's Heart. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next chapter is going to be up, subscribe, hit the bell. If you want to read this story, it is available on Ream Story. And if you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. Links are in the notes, and with that, I shall wish you a good day.